We have Fareed Zakaria, who is really one of the most incisive thinkers and most versatile thinkers on foreign affairs in this country. He was born in India. He went to school at Yale and got a PhD at Harvard. And he has been an editor and a writer almost everywhere, but particularly foreign affairs, and now he's the editor-in-chief of Newsweek International.
And The New Yorker.
And he's written for The New Yorker, I should say. Not often enough. His first book, The Future of Freedom, introduced into the language the notion of illiberal democracy, and that book was a bestseller and an extremely original essay on foreign affairs. Now there's a new book and a new bestseller called The Post-American World, and it's introduced the notion of the rise of the rest, which we will get into a discussion about. But first, Fareed, I wanted to begin with this image, and forgive the narcissism of it. In August 1991, I was sitting on the banks of the Moscow River, and I saw, as the world did, a scene of untold optimism. And the optimism was there were fireworks going off over the Kremlin. Communism as an ideology had collapsed. The Soviet Union in its worst incarnation had collapsed. And more to the point, the Cold War dualism had collapsed once and for all in the best sense. And out of it rose a notion of the end of history in terms of Francis Fukuyama's notion. And maybe even more importantly, the idea of the United States as a sole superpower. What could we possibly have been thinking in 1991? Why were we so deluded into that notion of that was the way history was going to go for a while?
Well, I think that I'm not sure it was so much a delusion as it was a kind of temporary phenomenon. Because what did happen in 1989, 91, which you pick your year, is a 200-year-old argument about how to organize your society collapsed. You know, for 200 years, basically since the French Revolution, there had been an argument in the Western world, and thus exported to the rest of the world, about how you would organize your society politically and economically. And broadly speaking, there were two sets of arguments, to the left and to the right, and the reason they were called to the left and the right is that was how people sat in the French National Assembly right after the French Revolution. And on the left, it was an argument about much larger state intervention, and on the right, it was an argument in those days called liberalism. And I remember growing up in India in the 70s and feeling like that was, that really did define the kind of world, the spectrum. There was the American model out there, capitalism and free trade. And there was the Russian model, the Soviet model, which was central planning and all that kind of thing. And India was sort of in the middle, somewhere trying to do a third way, a middle path. And what happens in 1991 is that spectrum collapses, because you see the collapse of central planning, you see the collapse of the Soviet model, and there's really only one game in town all of a sudden. And everybody begins to sort of figure out, how do you play that game? So I think it was real. And it was also true that because the Soviet Union collapsed, the United States found itself in this remarkable position, really unprecedented since the Roman Empire, where there was only one global player in the system. I think the two mistakes we all made, were to not realize that everything passes, and that precisely because that moment was so unprecedented, it was unlikely to be permanent. And that after a while, history would begin again, in a sense.
And one of our notions was that somehow democracy had emerged as not only as a goal, but not only as an ideal state of affairs, but something that was going to come everywhere, that there was a democratic revolution. Now we find in the countries that you're concentrating on, especially in your new book, India, China, and elsewhere, that there is this kind of that if you're a Chinese leader or a Russian leader, you say to yourself, why exactly do I need to introduce democracy? If you're Vladimir Putin or the leaders of the Chinese Communist Party, what's the democratic impulse placed on them? Do they no longer have this notion after 1989, 1991?
I think what happened is we've realized that the process or the path to modernity is actually a very complicated one with many roads and byways and lanes, and that countries travel all along it. You know, that, of course, all these countries are in some sense or the other modernizing. That is to say, if you look at them compared with 20 years ago, and you've traveled, David, you've seen that. Russia is a much more modern country than it was in terms of its infrastructure, in terms of the consumerism, in terms of their access to information around the world, even in terms of political organization, things like that. But it doesn't look at all like the United States, and it doesn't look at all like Western Europe. And China is a much more open society than it was 30 years ago, you know, when Mao was still running it into the ground. But it doesn't look, I think that one of the common errors I think Americans make is to believe that all good things go together. Mm-hmm. You know, we like democracy and we like liberty. And so we assume that they always go together. We like democracy and liberty, and we also like a kind of cooperative foreign policy. So we assume they all go together. And that if somebody isn't doing one of those things, they must be all bad. You know, it must mean that everything else is bad.
One of the policies, certainly during the Carter administration and thereafter, vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, was human rights initiatives. That was a part of our foreign policy. Henry Kissinger might not have liked it very much, but it certainly became post-Kissinger part of that foreign policy. And when we evaluated the end of the Cold War, it was not only a technological revolution that led to the Soviet Union's collapse, some of it was a human rights pressure. Now, when the United States looks at China, we feel that's not so good. That human rights pressure, we apply it ever so slightly. And in fact, you yourself have written recently that we shouldn't apply it so heavily at all because, in fact, we'd be hypocritical, is essentially what you're saying. We should not pressure the Chinese over much on Tibet. Am I getting that right?
Sure. I mean, I think that part of the problem with something like Tibet is, again, we view the Tibet issue really as a dictatorship. We view it through the prism of dictatorship versus democracy. And Tibet is really an issue of nationalism versus minority rights. That is to say, if you think about the way the Chinese view Tibet, or the way that the Tibet plays itself out, 95% of the Chinese people agree with their government on this subject. I mean, it's a 95% Han Chinese majority in China. They have no particular sympathy for the Tibetans. They feel that the Chinese government subsidizes Tibet, in effect taxes them to subsidize Tibet, and they think that, if anything, the Chinese have been too lax on Tibet. So my point is, just as the Russians are not particularly nice to the Chechens, the Indians are not particularly liberal in Kashmir, and they're a flourishing democracy, the Turks have not been particularly nice until recently to the Kurds, that the Chinese are not particularly nice to Tibet. But we wouldn't be mistaking the situation if we thought, oh, this is, you know, there is a kind of Andrei Sakharov-like figure in China who is going to rally the Chinese people to this cause. No, no, no. The Chinese people agree with their government. So you'd be playing into the hands of Chinese nationalism.
Was Tiananmen Square a delusion in that sense?
I think Tiananmen Square was not a delusion, but that was more an issue of human rights versus a dictatorial government. Because there you were, I hate to put it this way, there you were fighting for the rights of Han Chinese. You know, and I think one thing we've discovered, you know, in Iraq is we can be a little naive about recognizing these ethnic, these ascriptive dimensions to societies. That if you can't be taking the side of a small minority that is not widely regarded as a legitimate case of human rights. I think what happened with Tiananmen, by the way, is over the last 15 or 20 years, China has opened up a lot more than people realize. You know, these are rights that Thomas Jefferson or John Locke would understand. That is to say, the rights of property, the rights of movement, there is increasingly some right for religious worship. So, for instance, Chinese Christians are having a kind of resurgence, but there are no political rights. And it's, you know, so it's more complicated than just saying China is a brutal dictatorship. It is, but it has also created some areas of openness within the society, and they have become escape valves, and thus no replay of Tiananmen.
Your book comes out at a time when other books and other commentators are talking the language of American decline, that the American century has come to an end, the American hegemony and singularity is fast declining economically, maybe with the exception of militarily, although militarily, because of the rise of asymmetrical warfare, that too is in a state not just of decline but humiliation. You don't share that view. You don't share that view of the end of American super strength.
No, I mean, I begin the book by saying this is a book not about the decline of America, but the rise of everyone else. And it's really the extraordinary
So it's like
tale.
my kids' soccer league. Everybody's a winner.
Exactly, exactly. It's you know, when you looked at one of these science tests that we do and we routinely do badly at, and the South Koreans do fantastically at the end of this test, they asked the kids who had taken them, this is South Koreans and Americans, how do you think you did on the science test? And the Americans all said, oh, we did fantastically. And the South Koreans all said, we did terribly. And you can imagine what happened was the results were, of course, the South Koreans had done very well and we had done very badly. And, you know, and Bill Bennett, I remember, I think he was Secretary of the Education at that point, concluded, he said, we are clearly much better at teaching self-esteem than science in this country. No, I think I'm making a not so politically correct point. The point I'm making is that the real story is that the rest of the world is rising, that you are seeing this extraordinary economic ferment. You know, 124 countries last year grew at over 4% a year. 122 countries in 2006 grew at over 4% a year. Now, in economic terms, this is a win-win because it creates a larger and larger pie. And you see it, you know, these billions of people escaping poverty are becoming producers and consumers and even investors, and it's producing pools of wealth around the world. I mean, if not for the wealth that's been created around the world, Citicorp would have gone bankrupt, Merrill Lynch would have gone bankrupt with all the cascading effects that would have had. So it's a good thing for there to be other sources and centers of wealth and things like that. Now, if the world of economics is win-win, the world of power, however, the world of political influence is not quite that way. Mm-hmm. And so as Russia becomes more important in its own sphere, and as China becomes more important in Asia, and as India becomes more important, and as Brazil becomes more important, who is becoming less important? That's my point, which is that the unrivaled freedom of action that the United States has had, particularly in the role of politics, diplomacy, influence, power, in that sense, is naturally now constrained. It's constrained by the reality of these much more powerful and proud and uppity countries that have suddenly discovered that they're actually doing all right.
Most of our focus in the press is on the, and I can't say it's not rightly so, the disasters of the previous administration. Do you think that this state of affairs was happening anyway, and no matter what the Bush administration did, right, wrong, or indifferent, could have done nothing to prevent this trend and this historical direction?
I think that the broad trends were happening anyway, and that they began in the Clinton years, by the way, that you began to see the rise of East Asia first, and then slowly, by the end, Latin America and things like that. I think what the Bush administration has done is, in my opinion, really jeopardized the extraordinary role the United States could play in this world. Because look, as this world rises, as these countries start doing better, you have more and more centers of power, but it does create a degree of unmanageability, to use an awkward word, a kind of a degree of chaos. And it does require coordination. It does require some kind of agenda setting, some convening power. And the United States is perfectly situated to do that. You know, look at Asia. People often talk about the rise of Asia. And as somebody who grew up in India, it just has never made any sense. Asia is a Western construct. There is no such thing as Asia. There's China, India, and Japan. And they kind of hate each other, you know? And the United States could play this kind of central role. I talk about in the book of this kind of Bismarckian role of having better relations with each of those countries than they have with each other. And thus bridge building and agenda setting and problem solving. Because all this growth is producing all kinds of problems. I mean, look at the energy, environmental issues. That's where the Bush administration went wrong, because, you know, the familiar litany of the arrogance and the unilateralism and the incompetence has meant that role has become much more tenuous, because people look at the United States and say, we don't want you as chairman of the board, we don't want you setting the agenda. But they don't want anybody else doing it either. And so what we see now, right now, is just global paralysis in terms of the problem-solving function of kind of interstate cooperation.
Fred, unless you're Walter Lippmann and believe deeply in an American century ongoing, this book is a very hopeful book. It even extends hope to the continent of Africa. The one place where it seems almost to the point of despairing is in the Middle East. that the potential, the economic potential, the political potential there is grim. What's the problem? What's the endemic problem with the Middle East? Or is it a kind of historical time lag between it and the rest of Asia, as, forgive my use of the word, but other parts of the world?
Okay, what I'm going to say will sound a little bit like some things George Bush has said. They are still true. The Middle East, I think, does have a particular political pathology that has developed as a combination, with a combination of oil and dictatorship, has produced a real political stagnation that is very difficult to break. You know, if you think about the rest of the world, over the last 30 years, in every country in the world, pretty much every country in the world, you would say that they are more free in some sense of the word, economically, politically, socially, than they were 30 years ago. I think you couldn't really make that claim about the Middle East. There are parts of the Middle East where you could make that claim, but basically it's not true. Certainly, if you think about the ferment of Egypt in the early 50s, compared with now, it is a more repressive society, a more closed society. The same is true of Syria. The same is largely true of Libya. And I think what happened was you had oil and you had failed dictatorships, and the two kind of combined, you created a kind of unholy alliance. There is some hope.
Where?
Some of the things that are happening in places like Dubai and Abu Dhabi, a lot of it is gimmicks. A lot of it is the kind of, you know, nouveau riche expenditures of money. But it is bringing the world in, and it is opening up the society.
You say that that you will see real change in the Middle East only if you see it happening in a major cultural political center like Egypt.
To me, that's the only kind of thing that would catch on. And that was really the hope of Iraq. You know, there were not a lot of places like that. The one place where you do see it, by the way, it also has to be a non-oil producing country, because the oil just screws everything up. Jordan is actually doing quite well. And to give you a sense of what the potential here is, 7 years ago, Jordan's exports to the United States were $50 million. Then we set up a Jordanian-American free trade agreement, and we told them, you know, if you can make stuff that's competitive, value-added, we'll buy it. Jordan's exports to the United States now are over $1 billion in 7 years. But it's a tiny country. It's 4 million people.
Fareed, you have three, call it 2.5 political candidates left in the race for the presidency. Who, in your view, and you've been described as either a conservative Democrat or a moderate Republican, you're a centrist. Who, in your view, gets what you're talking about at the tip of the finger level, understands it most acutely to your satisfaction, and why? Who gives you the most confidence in this new version of modernity?
You know, I have always had a lot of respect for McCain. But John McCain is a man of great honor and courage, I think personal courage, but also political courage. He's taken stands that were very unpopular in the Republican Party on global warming, on torture, on campaign finance reform. But I do feel as though the more I have read about his foreign policy, the more I think he has, the technical term I think would be, he has drunk the neocon Kool-Aid. You know, he gave a speech recently which was really bizarre, and it's, you know, in kind of doubling down on every bad bet that George Bush has made. He gave a speech explaining that what his foreign policy was going to consist of was mounting a campaign to kick Russia out of the G8, then expand the G8 but pointedly exclude China and take India and Brazil in, then set up a league of democracies that would try to fight terrorism, but presumably do so while excluding and humiliating Egypt and Jordan and Saudi Arabia and Singapore, which are all non-democracies. And you think to yourself, if he's going to do all that, and then, by the way, of course, bomb Iran, and you think to yourself, when is he going to have time to fix the economy? If he's, you know, this is a pretty full agenda. So I worry a lot about McCain's basic foreign policy at this point. He used to be much more sensible. I think this is the danger of what's happened to the Republican Party, is that they all, you know, they want a certain kind of heroism, national greatness. And it reminds me of the wonderful line of Harold Macmillan, the British Prime Minister, when somebody asked him, "What is your vision for Britain?" And he looked at him and said, "My good man, if you want a vision, consult a saint. I'm a politician." And I think, you know, there's a little bit more modesty at this point, particularly at this point, would make sense.
So in terms of a saint and a politician, we're now down to Hillary and Obama. So Hillary-ish at this point. I mean, she seems to be fast fading, but you never know. So what about those two?
I think Hillary, I think they're both very bright. I think Hillary is a very intelligent politician. But to your question, and the bottom line is, I do think Obama gets this world more than any of the others. He's a child of it in a sense. I do think it matters. I mean, I hate to personalize this, but I do think one thing that has helped me in my life in writing about these things is, I do understand what it's like not to be an American. And it's a very difficult thing to understand, because being the 800-pound gorilla in the room is very different from being the small mouse in the room looking at the 800-pound gorilla. And it's something Americans have a very tough time understanding. I think for a variety of reasons he gets that. He's a very smart guy. Look, I'll be honest, he's an empty vessel. I'm putting into him a certain hope about what he'll be like. But I see many good signs, and I see particularly a willingness to think afresh and to get away from the kind of, the traps of the past of saying, well, if you talk to the Iranians, it means you must actually love them secretly and want to turn into a mullah, or, must be raised a Muslim, or, he's talked about...
He's not a mullah, so far as I know. So far as I know.
But, I feel as though it's important to have somebody like that, potentially as president, because it would be such a refreshing break, not so much from the country. I think increasingly Americans are beginning to be aware of this world. Certainly, corporate America increasingly gets it because they live and die in this global marketplace. But Washington really doesn't get it. So it would be nice to have one guy in Washington who can tilt the balance a little.
Well, there you have it. Fareed Zakaria endorses Obama for president. And thank you all for coming.